And I will now pass it over to CFUW National President, Katherine Wilkinson, to give her opening remarks.
Thank you, Charlotte. There's no need to read the next few slides. They're here because they are going to be in the webinar that's uploaded. So as Charlotte just said, I'm Katherine Wilkinson. I'm National President of the Canadian Federation of University Women, or CFUW. At CFUW, we recognize that we are indebted to First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples, past, present, and future, and pay respect to them as we gather as guests across the land, air, and sea in what is now known as Canada. Please share the land acknowledgement from which you are calling in the chat. We also recognize that land acknowledgements are merely starting points in the journey of reconciliation and must also be accompanied by meaningful action to redress past and ongoing forms of colonialism. CFUW is proud to convene this panel of pay equity experts and care work advocates today to address the current state of gender inequalities in paid and unpaid care work and future solutions for a gender-inclusive economic recovery plan. For those of you who are new to our organization, CFUW is a self-funded, non-partisan organization founded in 1919 that works to improve the status of women by promoting human rights, public education, social justice, and peace in Canada and abroad. With nearly 7,000 members across Canada, CFUW clubs and the CFUW Charitable Trust donate well over $1 million in fellowships and awards for women to pursue post-secondary education. You can visit www.cfuw.org for more information about joining a club near you. So CFUW first called for equal pay for equal work in 1920. We then called for equal work of equal value in 1985. Since then, CFUW clubs and members have been fierce pay equity advocates. But I would be remiss if I did not mention that this week, Canada has taken a very important step forward to ensure that all women with children who choose to work are able to do so, as we celebrate the fact that all 13 provinces and territories have finally, Ontario was the holdout, have finally signed on to the federal government Canada-wide early learning and childcare agreements. CFUW has been actively advocating for such a system since 1960. And the next step, we shall say pay equity. So in 2021, CFUW was generously awarded a grant from the Economic and Social Development Canada to offer a series of virtual pay equity workshops dedicated to equipping young women with the tools to thrive in the workforce. We've been so pleased to have Mackenzie Chellengoff on board as our pay equity advocacy and workshop coordinator to administer this project. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Mackenzie to provide a brief overview of the project and her work over the past few months. Thank you, Mackenzie.
Thank you, Katherine. So as Katherine said, my name is Mackenzie Chellengoff. I'm the Pay Equity Advocacy and Workshop Coordinator with the Canadian Federation of University Women. So thank you all for joining us today for this exciting discussion. For the past several months, CFUW has been spearheading a three-part workshop series entitled Empowering Young Women Through Pay Equity. So this series has been breaking down misconceptions about the gender pay gap and pay inequity in Canada, and offering practical tools to help diverse women pursuing post-secondary education to bolster their professional toolkit. With a focus on salary negotiation and advocating for pay equity, we've provided extensive training on topics such as resume building, how to conduct market research to benchmark a desired salary, how to navigate tricky salary negotiation scenarios, and how to get involved and advocate for yourself and diverse women across Canada. Our series equips the leaders of tomorrow with the skills, knowledge, and resources to address pay inequity today. So our series has seen outstanding success, and we've had the privilege of building sustainable partnerships with offices, organizations, and institutions from across Canada, most notably collaborating on this project with the Ontario Pay Equity Office, as well as the New Brunswick Coalition for Pay Equity. So to close out our pay equity series, we are excited to be hosting this panel discussion with leading pay equity experts and care work advocates. And I will pass it off to CFUW's National Advocacy Coordinator, Charlotte Aiken, to introduce our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mackenzie. Today, we are joined by a wonderful slate of panelists who I think will provide such a great perspective on this very timely conversation. So we are joined today by Dina Ladd, the Executive Director of the Workers' Action Center. And Dina has been working to improve wages and working conditions in sectors of work that are dominated by low wages, violations of rights, precarious and temporary work for the past 30 years. She has worked to support and develop grassroots training, education, organizing with groups such as the Fight for 15, the Fairness Campaign, Decent Work, and Health Network, as well as Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. Dina is one of the founders and executive director of Toronto's Workers' Action Center. The Workers' Action Center organizes to improve wages and working conditions with low-wage workers, women, racialized and immigrant workers in precarious jobs that face discrimination, violations of rights, and no benefits in the workplace. So thanks so much, Dina, for joining us. Next, we have Katherine Scott, senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Katherine is working as and serves as the director for its gender equality and public policy work. She has worked in the community sector as a researcher, writer, and advocate for over 25 years, writing on a range of issues from social policy to inequality to funding nonprofits. She's currently working on a national project examining the labor market experiences of marginalized female workers with the goal of identifying policy and program alternatives for advancing women's economic security in the post-pandemic economy. Next, we have Valerie Fry, and she's an economist at OECD's Directorate for Employment, Labor, and Social Affairs. Her research has focused on public opinion on economic risks and governance, social program evaluation, and female labor force participation. Valerie is the lead researcher and project manager of the Cross-National Risks That Matter Household Survey. And prior to joining the OECD, Valerie worked as a consultant for the World Bank Governance and Public Sector Management Group and as a research assistant at Yale University, where she earned a PhD. Next, we're joined by Rachel Vickerson. She is the executive director of the Association of Early Childhood Educators in Ontario. She's been working hard over these past couple of months. The Professional Association for Early Childhood Educators in the province. She holds a master's degree in public policy from the University of Toronto and a bachelor in history and political science from University of King's College. She has worked in a variety of childcare settings, as well as previously working in childcare policy research at the Childcare Research and Research Unit, and as a project officer with the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare. She's committed to centering early childhood educators' voices in many intersecting areas of public policy that create the conditions for decent work and community. Next, we have Karen Jensen. She was appointed as Canada's first federal pay equity commissioner in October 2019. She has represented unions and employers in pay equity disputes at different points in her legal career. In addition, as a full-time member of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal from 2005 to 2009, Karen adjudicated and mediated human rights disputes, including pay equity matters in both official languages. Prior to joining the commission, Karen was a partner of Norton Rose Fulbright LLP and was a national and local chair of their labor and employment group. A significant part of her legal practice involved in advising and representing employers in complex pay equity disputes. And lastly, our moderator, commissioner and CAO of the Ontario Pay Equity Office, Katie Ward, is unfortunately able to join us as she's feeling quite ill, but we have two members of her team who will be delivering her wonderful opening remarks. So I'll pass it over to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I just want to make sure you can hear me, you can see me. Okay, great. Yes, my name is Ayumi Bayi. I'm the director of the Pay Equity Office, and normally I'm behind the scenes, keeping the organization together. And so I'm going to do my best to do justice to Katie's remarks, which fortunately were prepared ahead of time. So forgive me for committing the cardinal sin of public speaking, which is that I'm going to mostly read the remarks that have already been prepared. But they are good remarks, so please focus on the content and not the delivery. I'll start with her own opening words, which is that she acknowledges how honored she feels to serve as the commissioner for the Pay Equity Commission of Ontario. The Pay Equity Office is an agency of the Ministry of Labour, Training and Skills Development here in Ontario, and that's a ministry that's vital to supporting a vibrant, safe, competitive, equitable, and well cared for workforce. We hope that everyone else on the panel today agrees that it's vital to both the community and the economy that employment is prosperous. Employment, but it's not just any old employment, it's employment that pays well and allows for progress and self-actualization. The pays well part of employment is central to our work at the Ontario Pay Equity Office. There is right now currently a sense of urgency to our work as the twin economic and health crises that we've experienced have the potential to roll back gender equality and the gains that it's brought to workforces in Canada and globally over the last few decades. Just last month, Canada's labour market showed signs of finally shaking off the shockwave of COVID-19, the shockwave that COVID-19 delivered 2 years ago with a deep regression in women's labour market participation. Consistent with historical trends, the employment rate is lower amongst visitable minority women. And also consistent with historical trends, the recovery is more established for men than women already, even in these early days. We should look deeper, though, than just the number of jobs that have rebounded. It's not just the quantity, but it's also the quality of jobs that we should be focusing on. Women continue to be clustered in sectors such as care, clerical work, and childcare, and these sectors have historically been undervalued. Coupled with this, it's the disproportionate amount of added family caregiving responsibilities that women shouldered through rolling lockdowns with school and daycare closures. So the pandemic has triggered a reckoning about how we value paid and unpaid work done by women. Fundamentally, attitudes about and the division of care work needs to shift. We need to rethink care and divisions of labor, and we need to support women in the labor market. Gender equalities in the home and in employment originate in the gendered representations of productive and reproductive roles that persist across different cultures, religious beliefs, and socioeconomic contexts. With regional variations, the male breadwinner family model overall remains very much ingrained within the fabric of societies, and women's caring role in the family and society continues to be central. But this is changing. We do see progress with changes to family structures and aging societies that point to an increase in the number of both women and men confronting unpaid care work and the gendering of jobs in the labor market. For progress to continue, policymakers, employers, and communities all need to support gender equalizing approaches, such as the changes in attitudes towards working mothers and a more egalitarian division of paid work and unpaid care work between women and men. Over the past 2 years, we've coined the terms she-session and she-covery with elected officials, talking about a feminist post-COVID recovery. Over the past 2 years, we've seen so many stories about women, so many studies regarding women's participation in the labor market and the inequalities that persist. We need to keep that conversation going so that policymakers at both federal and provincial levels continue to address women's economic justice and support a more egalitarian division of paid work and unpaid care work between men and women, or between two partners in a home. If we do this, we can continue to support closing the gender wage gap. While Ontario has had the most advanced pay equity legislation globally for the past 30 years, the gender wage gap persists here. It took 20 years in Ontario to narrow the hourly gender wage gap 8 percentage points from 19% in 1988 to 11% in 2020 in this province. Structural changes are required to close the gender wage gap, and these changes include how we confront the gendering of care work. So let's reflect together today on the economics of care work and on what changes need to happen in Canada and globally for society to value and equitably compensate women. So I think, Charlotte, we might now move into the panel portion of the program. Is that right?
Yes, perfect. Yeah, so our first section is on the economics of care work.
Okay, so I'm happy to go right into the questions for each of the panelists, if that's all right with you. Okay, so I'd like to put this question to Valerie. Valerie, COVID-19 revealed just how important care work is to the functioning of our global economies. Could you talk about the care economy in the global context and how the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing gender equalities in paid and unpaid care work in terms of increased care responsibilities for women and girls?
Thanks, Yumi. Hi, everyone. Many thanks to the Canadian Federation of University Women for the invitation to this event, which I think we can all agree covers a very important and timely topic. So as Charlotte noted, I work at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. And for those who don't know, this is an intergovernmental organization headquartered in Paris, France. So I'm calling in from Europe tonight. And here at the OECD, we have a gender data portal where we collect data on things like gender differences in labor force participation, women's representation in management roles, women's representation across different sectors, and also unpaid work outcomes across countries. So thinking about what happened during the pandemic, labor force outcomes have really varied across countries. Some countries did better than others in ensuring gender equality in employment rates, for example, and offered different levels of social protection that helped keep women in the labor force. But one consistent lesson that we've learned, and it really seems to hold across OECD countries, is that many women, and particularly mothers, were very negatively affected by unpaid care obligations, and that these women facing high unpaid care burdens experience very negative effects on their ability to engage in paid work and have economic security. So what happened? I think we need to start out by recognizing something that I'm sure many of you already know, that prior to the pandemic, in every country in the world, women were doing more unpaid care work than men. So women were more likely to be caring for children, caring for elderly relatives, caring for family members with disabilities than men were. We have some data on this in our gender data portal and social institutions and gender index. But when we look just at OECD countries, and this is an organization made up of, frankly, the wealthiest, most democratic countries in the world with the strongest social protection systems, prior to the pandemic, women were still doing 2 more hours of unpaid work than men on average every day. And even in some of the most egalitarian countries, I think Sweden or Denmark, women were still doing an extra hour of work per day relative to men. So on the one hand, we went into the pandemic with this very deep, long-standing inequality in the division of unpaid caregiving. And then on the other hand, we know that women on average learn less than their male partners. So from a household finance perspective, it often makes more sense for a woman to leave her job than a man when someone has to stay home. So putting this all together, I think it came as a surprise to no one that when schools and childcare shut down, women took on the bulk of unpaid caregiving. They were disproportionately more likely to leave their jobs and stay home to care for children. Basically, women became the teachers and the childminders, but effectively unpaid agents of the state. And in response to this, many women had to cut their hours in the labor force, and many left the labor market entirely. And we have a good deal of data-driven evidence on this cross-nationally. So a lot of the academic research so far, looking at labor force outcomes and unpaid care outcomes, looked really at specific countries. Some of the time use data has been slow to come out, something countries can do better on, but there have been studies looking at the UK, the United States, and Germany, just to name a few, and they find that women were more likely to do unpaid caregiving than men during the pandemic. Here at the OECD, we were able to take advantage of a cross-national survey data set that we run across 20 OECD countries called the Risks That Matter survey to try and develop some of the first cross-nationally comparative estimates of what happened in paid and unpaid care work. And what we found has led us to suggest that what's been known as the COVID she session should actually be called the COVID mom session, because it was really mothers in particular that bore the brunt of unpaid work obligations, and they really drove these results we see in women's labor market penalties. Of course, it's very important to note that elder care and other forms of care also disproportionately fall on women. This particular research was asking about what happened to mothers. So here's what we found. We found that mothers were nearly 3 times as likely as fathers to say that they took on the majority or all of the added unpaid care work related to school or childcare facility closures. And on average across countries, this equals out to about 62% of mothers of kids under age 12 saying they took on most or all of the extra care work, while only 22% of fathers say that they did that. This ratio is similar in Canada. We have data for Canada as well. We also find that mothers of children under age 12 were the group that was most likely to move from employed to not employed status between the end of 2019, right before the pandemic, and the third quarter of 2020 on average across countries. And this is when we compare mothers to almost every other subgroup, regardless of the age of children. When we compare mothers of dependent children to fathers with dependent children of all different ages, men without dependent children, women without dependent children, by far mothers fared worse everywhere. And we found that the gender gaps in unpaid care were the largest on average when the father continued to be employed and the mother was not employed. But we don't see this relationship reciprocated in households where the mother was working and the father was not. We see fathers picking up more work, but not even close to the same degree as mothers did. And we find that these gender gaps are correlated cross-nationally with the length of school shutdowns in different countries. So mothers were especially hard hit in terms of labor force participation, employment rates, and they took on more unpaid care in countries that had really long-lasting school shutdowns. In countries with shorter shutdowns, we see much fewer labor market losses for mothers. So this is the case in France, for example. Schools closed for a few months in spring 2020. They were largely open after that, and mothers seem to have suffered less than they did in countries where schools were shut down for much longer. And then in the same survey, it's a survey of risk perception. So we ask people, what are they worried about? And we find cross-nationally that women are much more likely than men to say that they're worried about their household's financial security looking ahead for the next few years. So I think this gives us a pretty decent sense of what happened during the pandemic. It's one of these findings that's it's not really a surprise to anyone, but it's good to have the data to say this is actually what's happening on the ground. I think now we face the question of what happens next. So if I'm trying to find a silver lining here, on the one hand, one silver lining on this of the uptick in unpaid work obligations for all parents is that there's some evidence that fathers did more unpaid work during the pandemic. So this has come out of some studies of time use data in the United Kingdom, for example. They're pretty good at collecting that data. So this could have good long-term effects. You know, we see this in studies of paternity leave and parental leave reserved for fathers, where leave taking leads to long downstream effects on gender equality in the household. But overall, we have a pretty strong suspicion and a lot of data suggesting that mothers did much more. And there's a lot that mothers still need to recover from. One obvious example of this is that in countries where childcare is often more privately provided, this tends to be the case more in North America than in Europe. We're seeing tremendous shortages of childcare facilities as many of these facilities shut down during the pandemic. This is going to have long-lasting effects on mothers' ability to reintegrate into the labor force. But as you all know, there are no easy fixes to increasing the supply of childcare facilities or creating good quality, well-paid caregiving jobs for women to go into. So in sum, I think we have a long road and a lot of work ahead of us.
That's great. Thank you very much. Those are, as you said, Valerie, not surprising, but really great to have that solid data. Data is our friend, evidence is our friend, and very much appreciate the little tiny glimmer of the silver lining offered. We'll take that as well as being very pragmatic and realistic in recognizing the serious work that's in front of us. So my next question is for Katherine Scott on the economics of care work. Katherine, are you ready?
I am.
So in Canada, women's economic security was hard hit by the pandemic, particularly those facing intersecting systemic discrimination. They were the ones who suffered the largest and most profound losses. Again, something that should not be a surprise, sadly. What could you tell us, what is the status of women's participation in the workforce in Canada 2 years into this pandemic? Could you also address women's labor market segregation into the relatively poor paying care sector and how this segregation contributes to the gender pay gap?
Thank you so much. I'm pleased to be participating today. It's a tremendous opportunity to reflect on this critically important topic of pay equity and gender pay gaps in a context in a week where we saw the conclusion of the childcare agreement. I think it's a really important conversation. I'm very pleased to be participating. I'm with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in their national office, and we've been really spent this last 2 years tracking the evolving impact of the pandemic. A good deal of my attention has focused on what's happened with women's economic recovery, and in particular the recovery of marginalized women in hard-hit sectors such as the care economy. The pandemic's been called the Great Revealer, and I guess I would argue that the reality of patriarchy and racism and ableism and colonialism certainly has always been readily evident. But what COVID-19 did was graphically reveal the ways in which inequality is baked into our institutions, into our government, and into our economy. And it certainly blew open our social safety net, revealing the precarity and deadly consequences of our reliance on market-based services in fields like long-term care, as well as the negligent and exploitative treatment of care workers as reflected in their persistently low wages. There was a fleeting moment, I think we can all agree, at the beginning of the pandemic when care workers were held up as heroes, some receiving temporary pay top-ups, recognizing their extraordinary efforts, and certainly to help stem the exodus from different services. But suffice to say, these efforts have barely scratched the surface. So what I'd like to do today is zero this conversation in on the last 2 years in Canada and what the standing of care workers are, current standing care workers in Canada, and to provide that kind of context right now for the discussion we're going to have about strategies for moving pay equity forward. Care workers in Canada make up a very sizable group. There was a study out this past year from StatsCan that estimated that there are as of the last census, we're going to have new data soon, but as of 2016, there were 3 million people engaged in the care economy in both the public and private sectors, making up nearly a fifth of total employment in Canada. So an extraordinarily large sector. Women, of course, are disproportionately represented in this sector. They make up over 75% of all care workers, and an even larger share, of course, of those in lower paid occupations, such as housekeepers and cleaners, nurses, personal support workers, and the like. And within these occupations, of course, racialized women and immigrant women, in particular new immigrant women, play an outsized role, particularly among Filipino and Black women. As a consequence, women in care occupations have lower average employment incomes than men do in care occupations, even after taking into account personal characteristics like level of education, hours of employment, and the like, as well as the occupations they're engaged in. This same study found that the pay gap among care workers was 80.8%. So 80%, a female care worker in Canada makes 80 cents on the dollar as her comparable male colleague does. And of course, these pay gaps are larger for Indigenous women, racialized women, and immigrant women. For example, racialized women made on average 71% of a non-racialized male care worker. And it was similar for among Indigenous women at around 70 cents on the dollar. The largest gap of those studied of the analysis of those studied in this study, sorry, that makes no sense. Anyway, the largest gap was among women or female care workers who had non-permanent immigration status. They made $42,000 on average less than comparable on non-immigrant male care workers. That's a wage gap of 43%. It gives you the scope of the scale of the challenge in front of us. So fast forward to March 2020, Canada's care economy comes under intense pressure as governments struggle to arrest accelerating case counts, treat the victims of this new illness, and mitigate the massive economic and social shock that followed in its wake. Care workers in the aggregate did not actually experience the same scale of employment loss when the pandemic hit as other sectors of the economy, as much of their work was deemed essential. After an initial decline in numbers in the spring of 2020, levels of employment among care workers basically rebounded, and they had fully recouped all of the pandemic-related losses by the end of 2020. Over the past 2 years, from this 2020 and 2021, we've actually seen modest growth in the number of women working in care. It's up 1.4% between December 2019 and December 2021, roughly a growth of 28,000 jobs. That said, there's been significant loss of capacity in many community-based sectors, community-based care services, such as immigrant settlement agencies, childcare centers, and the like. Here, we've seen female employment among home care providers and community support occupations actually fell by 2.7%. These, of course, are headline employment statistics, and they don't begin to tell the story of the devastating toll that COVID-19 pandemics had on care workers, the exponential rise in demands on these workers, as well as the huge challenges involved in delivering quality care, all within a system that's been drained and strained of resources, underinvestment, and inadequate planning for decades. We know as well, we see this in the current reports on levels of fatigue and stress among care workers across the board, nurses in particular, many in the care economy, thinking about leaving employment in the next while. So this is all pretty critical context for understanding current wage and employment trends in the care economy and the substantial rise in demand for care workers. We've just had the last job vacancy and wage survey in Canada, and it revealed that in the last quarter of 2021, job vacancies had reached an all-time record high. They're 80% over levels reported in 2019, and particularly high in the healthcare and social assistance field. Job vacancies are twice the level they were 2 years ago. So you might think, given this context, that these conditions would be right for boosting wages and closing the gender pay gap in these key occupations. Yet that isn't proving to be the case. So again, looking back over the 2 years, we see that average hourly wages of most care workers have not actually kept pace with demand, nor particularly in the context of rising current inflation. For example, wages over the 2 years are up 3.5% among registered nurses. They're up 4.8% among childcare workers, and a meager 1.7% among social and community service workers. At the same time, but taking inflation into account, which has been running at 5.5% over the 2 years, these essential women majority care occupations are actually experiencing real income losses. We're losing ground. And if it hadn't been for moves such as temporary wage top-ups for PSWs and the like, that's personal care support workers, they would have been in the same boat too. So the question, or my question I'm grappling with right now, is what's it going to take? What's it going to take to raise the level of female care workers? And what's it going to take to close the pay gap? I mean, there are certainly the challenge for us, and I think we can discuss today in greater detail, is how to leverage the critical demand for care work in ways that value and uplift these workers and reduce gender disparities in pay and working conditions. We see the pressures and higher vacancy rates are pushing up wages, notably for new hires, but there's really significant stumbling blocks ahead of us that must be tackled in any strategy that's going to look at reducing or advancing gender equality. And these include legislated public sector wage restraint packages that are in place, such as Bill 124 here in Ontario, the lack of robust and proactive pay equity legislation and pay transparency across the country. Obviously we have some notable examples in Ontario, Quebec, and at the federal level, but again, this is not consistent across the country. We've seen as well in this crisis the turn to increasing the number of temporary foreign workers, and I'm sure Dean will speak to this in greater, as an effort to undercut wage, certainly and it works to undercut wages in the care economy. And actually some governments turning to volunteers, so-called, to help meet critical care shortages. And it must be said, it's continuing apace that we've seen the introduction of new gig platforms into sectors like long-term care during the pandemic. entities such as Staffy and BookJane, which will effectively and persistently undermine the working conditions of workers and further erode the foundations of quality care. So I think we're at a moment where both the pandemic has highlighted the centrality and the vital importance of women's care work, yet we still are behind the 8 ball in terms of translating this newfound recognition into meaningful change for women. So I'll stop it there, and I'm happy to share my slides. I have some of the data that I've worked up for this presentation with the group if you're interested, and looking forward to the discussion of strategies for moving forward. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Katherine. I think thank you, Katherine. I think given the power of all of the information you compact into those couple of minutes, I think there'll be a lot of interest in your slide deck. So just being mindful of the time, I am going to move straight to a question for Dina Ladd. So Dina, the Workers' Action Center, well-respected, long-standing organization, advocates for workers who are impacted by low wages and precarious employment to know their rights at work and how to protect themselves when the law doesn't, especially for predominantly racialized women and immigrant workers. Could you speak a bit about why the Workers' Action Center needed to fill this gap, and what can policymakers do to ensure that women in low-paid and precarious work are protected and compensated fairly for their labor?
Great, thank you. I think Katherine started to allude to this in her sort of remarks just now, is all of the ways in which, workers, and I think in particular women workers, have started to be excluded from protections. And so what I've seen as an organizer in the, working predominantly in the private sector, but also with a lot of workers in personal support work, childcare, migrant work, all the kinds of work that many Black, racialized, immigrant, migrant women do in our economy that's considered to be essential, right? And so our center supports workers in these sectors to fight for their rights. They're mainly non-unionized. And so the kind of big trends that we've been seeing, which has led to this crisis that we're in, is sort of over the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen employers systematically want to avoid their responsibilities for their workforce. So this is either through using temporary agencies, through using subcontracting, through using strategies such as misclassification. So basically telling you you're an independent contractor, you're self-employed, and so we have no responsibility for you. And so we saw this really emerge, especially in long-term care, where we saw this deterioration of standards in long-term care, resulting from mainly using racialized women as personal support workers who are hired through a myriad of subcontractors, temp agencies, all working short-term, part-time hours with no benefits, no paid sick days, very low wages, no unionization, and having to sort of move from residential home or long-term care facility to long-term care facility. We see that in the shelter system. We see that in group homes or any sort of care facilities. We see that in childcare. And I think that, so that's why we exist, because these are the kinds of conditions. And of course, we knew this way before the pandemic, have been sounding the alarm bells on this for quite some time. And so there are some very clear solutions for what needs to happen. We need to rebuild our basic floor of protections and standards. Right now, it's like Swiss cheese. There are holes in it like you wouldn't believe, and women and racialized workers migrant workers are just falling through those holes with no protection. And so what we need to do is we need to expand our basic employment standards to provide that sort of strong floor of protection, to make sure that no matter how you're hired, who you're hired by, that they take responsibility for your wages and working conditions. So it doesn't matter if it's a company that's hired an temporary agency to hire you, they are fully responsible for your health, for your safety, if you have an injury at work, and for your working conditions, that you cannot be used by these intermediaries, by these labor leases, by these third parties to basically undercut wages and working conditions. And so many of our community members, especially if we're racialized and Black women, are being used as a way to do the same work, but at less pay, to do the same work with no benefits, to do the same work with less protection. And so our strategy has been to rebuild that floor of standards and protection so that women are able to speak up on the job without risk of losing their jobs. We're fighting for equal pay for equal work. We're fighting for basic standards that, you know, before the pandemic were considered a luxury, like, you know, paid sick days, but now we know are essential to not only the workers' safety, their family, but also the communities. And so we really fundamentally need people to stand up for workers who have the least power and protection in the workplace. Because if we don't do that, what we are doing is we're creating a system where employers are always going to find the cheapest labor source. So if they can hire you through an agency and pay you 40% less and not give you benefits and get rid of you just like that, why would they hire anyone directly, right? If they can call you a temporary worker or a part-time worker and have you working alongside a full-time worker and pay you $5 less and not give you benefits, why would they hire you full-time directly? So these are all loopholes and exclusions within our labor standards that allow employers to pay us fewer wages, fewer benefits, and we need to rebuild that. And I'll just say in closing that we do have a strong agenda that has been actually pulled together by many workers in this work, and it's in the Justice for Workers website that I'll post the link to, that has a way of rebuilding that floor, whether it's fighting for a $20 minimum wage, fighting for paid sick days, fighting for, you know, full employee rights. And I have to say that in Ontario, we're really dealing with a dangerous precedent-setting bill that is actually right now being currently debated, Bill 88, where basically they're saying if you are a delivery worker for platform apps, that you first of all will only be paid when you're in active engagement of work, and does not allow these workers to have full employee protection and full employee status. So that opens the door for other digital platform apps to hire women in healthcare, women in the hospitality sector, and in other sectors, in cleaning, in driving, in logistics, warehouse, to basically start to pay us on just active engagement of work. So not full minimum wage, not full rights, and start to create these substandard categories of workers. So we need to be all paying very close attention to Bill 88 in Ontario and to the ways in which the Ford government is really going down a path of institutionalizing racism and sexism within our basic labor standards. And I'll sort of hold off at that point because I know we've got a number of other speakers, but I'll post some links in the chat for you. Thanks.
That's great, Dina. Thank you. Thank you. And as always, very powerful comments coming from you. Again, being mindful of the time, I'd like to go straight to Rachel Vickerson next with a question for you. So Rachel, although advocates have been pushing for universal early learning and childcare for decades, the pandemic has brought this discussion into mainstream political discourse, especially with the federal government's $30 billion investment into building a Canada-wide system. What challenges have early childhood educators faced before and throughout the pandemic in terms of working conditions, wages, and valuation of their labor? And can you talk also a little bit about what supports are needed to address the early learning and childcare workforce crisis?
Thanks very much for those questions. So I think I just want to start off by recognizing that this is such an exciting time and an exciting week for us in childcare and in early learning. And I know that there are many folks on this call who've been on this webinar, who've been advocates and partners on this fight for a very long time, including CFUW. For over 50 years, we've been fighting for universal childcare and a national childcare system. And, there's still so much work to be done, but I hope everyone who's been part of that fight over the last 50 years has taken a moment this week to recognize their own work in that and celebrate that. And I just want to invite folks to an event we're having tonight at 7 o'clock that's really going to celebrate that work that's been done across the country. And I'm just putting the link in the chat now. And answer any other questions about that childcare deal. On that, I guess I'll shift over more to the question, speaking about early childhood educators. So early childhood educators are one part of the care work system. They are folks who are registered professionals. They've done a 2-year diploma, and there are many other childcare workers in childcare centers as well who do important work alongside ECEs. For ECEs, their working conditions have been very challenging for a very long time. And of course, the pandemic has only exacerbated a lot of what we've seen. They're always balancing many different balls, juggling those different areas all at the same time. The importance of care work and caregiving and looking after children, balancing that with pedagogical standards, program planning, and communicating those objectives to families. And then also all the licensing and health and safety standards that have to be followed as well, which of course got quite a bit more exhaustive during the last 2 years. So, all of that together, it's quite a lot of work. It's mentally, intellectual work, it's physical work. It's so, linked, that physical and mental work and care work. And many of these people are making less than $20 an hour. Many of educators in the field are doing this work for barely over minimum wage. And this is something, of course, we've all spoken about already. That care work is devalued across, all sectors, and it's made up of majority women. In childcare, it's 95% women. It's disproportionately racialized, and it's more so that racialized women are more likely to take up those lowest paid jobs in the childcare centers, when they are in there. So, throughout the pandemic, they were essential workers with a vulnerable population, but the recruitment and retention crisis, of course, just got worse. There was already significant challenges in drawing people into a field with these challenges, and then enabling them to stay, even when we hear from early childhood educators that they love this work, they want to stay in the work, but they've had to leave because they can't afford to stay and continue. So this is a real crisis we're grappling with. We're really, we were hoping to see much more in the childcare deal to address the workforce crisis. In the new deal, part of it in Ontario is the expansion of 86,000 new spaces, as well as the continued decreases in affordability, the opposite, increases in affordability that are going to be happening. But we know that none of this can be possible if there are not workers and early childhood educators that can work in these programs and that can bring that important, crucial knowledge into those spaces. So we really need to see a much higher wage floor for early childhood educators and all childcare workers. Currently in the deal that was signed with Ontario, we're hearing that it's $18 an hour as a wage floor, which we know is not a living wage anywhere in Ontario. And we're calling for instead a $25 an hour wage for all childcare workers and a $30 hour minimum wage for early childhood educators. We know that this is not the only part of this. It's similar to what Dina said. It's about creating a decent work movement for care work and for early childhood education. One part of that is the wages, and that's one part we're really going to be focusing on in coming months. But it's also paid sick days, it's decent work standards, it's paid planning time, and time to reflect and do that important pedagogical work that is at the crux of childcare. So, you know, right now we're really looking to see what we can do and continue to push this deal. We're seeing this as a starting point. Still lots of work to be done to make these jobs good jobs and jobs that people want to come into and stay in. I know that many folks have been part of this fight, and I encourage everyone to, you know, as much as we're celebrating, we also know there's so much more to do to stay apprised of this situation and to continue to ask in the upcoming provincial election here in Ontario, but across the country, how your childcare deal is impacting workers and early childhood educators, because this is a situation we've seen in many childcare deals across the country, that the workers have been forgotten along, you know, and we really are so excited for the families and the women that this childcare deal will impact, but we can't forget that the system will not function without early childhood educators, and they are so important, and we are so important to move this along into the national system that we know everybody needs. You know, so I just hope everyone stays up to date with it, knows the fight isn't over, but also please come out and celebrate with us tonight, and give yourself a pat on the back if you've been a childcare advocate over these last 50 years, because we're in a really great spot now to continue that fight.
Fantastic, Rachel, thank you very much. Okay, so again, I'm still being mindful of the time. Karen, just before I put my question to you, I wanted to just make a quick flag to the whole panel. We did have one wrap-up question. Well, we had two, but I think we're only really gonna have time for one. What I'd like to do is just give you kind of the condensed version, abbreviated version of that question, and give you a couple of minutes to think through your concentrated response so that we can close up or wrap up the panel within our time frame. So the group question, the wrap-up question is to ask each of you to share your thoughts on the top priorities needed to implement an intersectional, inclusive recovery plan that best supports female identifying individuals across Canada. So I think because we will be at crunch for time by the time we come to that wrap-up question, I'm going to say 1 minute per panelist and try to keep it to 3 top ideas, whichever takes less time. So I just wanted to give you that quick heads up because it's a slight reversal of our original plan. And Karen, I'll call on you last, so you've got the equivalent amount of time to organize your thoughts or reorganize your thoughts, because I know you've got lots of ideas already organized in your mind. So the question that I would like to put to you is this, Karen. There are several pieces of legislation in force across Canada, both at provincial and federal levels, that pertain to pay equity, and the newest being the Federal Pay Equity Act, which came into force this past August. So could you describe how this legislation works to close the gender wage gap and who's covered by it? What's the role of policy tools like proactive pay equity legislation in achieving pay equity in Canada? And if you can squeeze it in to your response, if you could also talk a little bit about what employers could do right now to begin working towards pay equity.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ayumi. I'm so grateful to be here, and I really do want to keep my comments brief and cede the floor to the other panelists who really have so much to say on this area, and I've been fascinated by it. The Federal Pay Equity Act would not seem to apply, at least on the face of it, as much to care workers. The federally regulated sphere is banking, telecommunications, interprovincial travel, the federal government, that kind of thing. So effectively 4,600 federally regulated employers and about 1.3 million employees who are now covered by this new legislation. But in fact, within the federal jurisdiction, there is a fair bit of care work that's done primarily, I guess, in the federal government. And in fact, when I was a member of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, I rendered a decision involving doctors and nurses in a federal government department And it was a pay equity case looking at a comparison of the value and the pay that was being provided in a discriminatory manner, in fact, to the nurses. So there are pockets within the federal jurisdiction of care work, and of course, teachers in federal penitentiaries and that kind of thing that are covered by this legislation. But essentially what the legislation tries to do is to build on the successes and the strengths of the legislation in both Quebec and Ontario that covers both private and public sectors, and then adds an element of challenge that may not be found in the other two pieces of legislation. What it does essentially is to take the burden off of employees to bring complaints about pay inequity, and it puts the burden on employers to proactively develop a pay equity plan. So even if they don't think that they have a pay equity problem, even if they think that they're paying people who are working in predominantly female jobs, say clerical workers, the same as people who are working in predominantly male jobs, say, warehouse people, they still have to do the analysis, and they have to do it within 3 years. And if they don't, there are some fairly stiff penalties, which is one of the ways in which the federal legislation tries to go a little bit beyond what you see in some of the provinces. So, there are 3 components to the legislation. There's an educational component, there's a dispute resolution component, and then there's a compliance enforcement component. And those are very, very important in order to ensure that employers do undertake this important task of looking at not just equal pay for equal work, but pay equity, which is equal pay for work of equal value. And of course, this proactive legislation is only one part of the equation. It's one tool to address the gender wage gap, and other things like early learning and childcare centers are extremely important. Improved financial support for training and learning, enhanced parental leave flexibility, pay transparency, panelists have spoke about that, and the continued appointment of skilled, talented women into leadership positions, as well as flexible work arrangements. So what we're encouraging employers to do right now is to really get on the job. They've got 3 years within which to develop these pay equity plans, and that as well is different now from the Ontario legislation in that, they can't take forever. They've got 3 years within which to develop these plans, analyze their pay practices, and many of them have to do that in a committee. And so that's an added challenge. I'm just going to add one thing, and I don't want you to come back to me, Ayumi. I want you to give any time that we have to the others. But I will say that one thing that all legislation in Canada is lacking, and I think it's one of the things that would be my priority for addressing pay inequity in Canada, and that is looking at the occupational segregation of women, and particularly BIPOC women in certain sectors. And the New Zealand pay equity legislation actually does a good job of allowing comparisons between sectors and addressing pay inequities within an entire sector. So all childcare workers compared to, say, all janitors in another sector, work that might be different but of equal value, and allows for the raising of wages in a sector like childcare, regardless of who the employer is. All childcare workers have to be raised to the pay of comparably valued male predominant work in another sector. And I think that is really a model that we should be looking at. It's to my way of thinking, it's the wave of the future in pay equity, and it would address the issue of intersectional identities and women who are clustered or trapped in occupational sectors that are underpaid and undervalued. Thanks, Ayumi, back to you.
That was amazing, Karen. Thank you. And thank you also for your generosity in offering up your time to the other panelists for a wrap-up question. just speaking to our audience for a moment, I know that we are a little bit over time. We're going to try to not to go too much more over time. But for those of you who are still hanging in there, thank you for your interest and your enthusiastic participation. We have unfortunately lost a couple of panel members because of other commitments. So I'm going to turn to Katherine and then Rachel and ask each of you to race through your top ideas, kind of, just do the fastest brain jump that you've ever done. So Katherine, please start.
Sure, thanks. These were great presentations, really interesting. Thinking about Karen's last suggestion around adopting a larger sectoral approach, and I think that's really an innovation. New Zealand, several countries have sort of set the way. We can lots of interesting things for us to consider. I want to make the point. This is, we've been talking about pay equity, but we've been talking about care work and like the connection between the two. And so often, obviously the roots of the pay discrepancies that women and racialized women, we all continue to experience in Canada and elsewhere, often lies in the types of work that women do, and given the devaluation of care work. And one of the recommendations invariably is how to establish greater parity and the encouraging of people to join other for women, for instance, non-traditional sectors, moving into STEM jobs and the like. I guess in considering care work, and why I think it's so important is we're not going to get to gender parity or a gender pay equity care unless we fix care work. Like, it just numerically is not going to happen, right? Given the persistent occupational segregation of labor in Canada, it actually has not moved much into the types of work that women tend to do or the cost. Actually, there has not been a great deal of movement in 50 years on that. The women may remain largely concentrated in health and caring occupations, in education, financial admin and support. And so in order to make real gender progress, we really have to tackle disparity in the care economy. Like, it's fundamental to making any progress. And I think Dina's really right. I know she's left it. We have to attend to what are the institutional structural factors that basically replicate gender inequality in the labor market and the economy. So it's critically important to create real decent work, the structures that facilitate that. It means strengthening our employment standards, making sure that all workers, regardless of their status, immigration status and the like, enjoy access to basic rights. It means, as she said, things like paid sick leave and the like, raising minimum wage, which has been a really powerful tool in basically pushing up the floor, and to having it realistically as to what actually approximates a living wage rather than what they can get away with. That's really critically, I think, an intervention at this point, and strengthening, as I said, pay equity regimes in every province and territory. I mean, those are sort of the fundamental things that need to happen in order to move forward on creating a much more equitable pay in the labor market for women in Canada.
Great. Thank you, Katherine. Rachel, your thoughts, your advice.
Thanks, Katherine. I feel like I have many of the same points, actually. But I think I just want to start off by, I think we all know, and the childcare deal being signed and the pandemic and long-term care, and people have spoken of the increased demands of elder care. Care work isn't going anywhere, and it's only going to expand as, part of our economy and part of the conversation. But what is not so entrenched is if those jobs are going to be decent work jobs or not. We know care work is going to be there. We don't know. And it's up to us to fight for those jobs to be decent jobs. And I think that's really the task at hand here, to entrench the value of that care work through policy, through legislation, and to create, those working standards that value care work in writing permanently and across all sectors. Because we know, it's really just, it's growing, and care work allows gender equity for all. So I think once we have, those policies and legislations that values care work and those as thriving career pathways and professions, then it allows so much more to happen in terms of gender equity. So you think about, if you have the childcare center down the street and those workers are paid well, and that center is allowed to expand because there's many early childhood educators who want to work there, then that means there's many more women who are able to now go to work because of that childcare center. Similarly, for elder care and personal support workers, there's a ripple effect that when we create decent work in these areas, we have a ripple effect into gender equity in all parts of society.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. Amazing discussion and beyond a gold mine of expertise and ideas in this panel. So I hope the panel will allow me to speak on their behalf in thanking the CFUW for pulling together such an extraordinary group of experts and role models. So thank you. And I'm going to hand the virtual microphone back to Charlotte.
I just want to echo those thanks. Thank you so much to our panelists. I know a few have left, but we really appreciate you providing your expertise and insight to this very timely discussion. And again, thank you, Ayumi, for your excellent moderation skills and for jumping in. You are fantastic, and we really appreciate your participation here. And again, please do attend that ACEO event that Rachel posted. It's time to celebrate. The work continues tomorrow, but maybe take a break today. So thank you so much for joining. And Katherine, would you just like to close out?
I would wanted to thank the panelists and to thank Mackenzie and Charlotte for all their work in setting this up. And thank you all for attending this afternoon. And I think, this week we should be celebrating what has happened with childcare. And it shows us that there really are great possibilities when women keep advocating and keep working together. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. Thank you.